My name is Marcus McCabe. I'm founder and director of Hempire Building Materials. I'm a permaculture designer and I've been working with ecological building materials for many years. And I've come to understand an awful lot about how buildings breathe. I live in a thatched house in a very wet climate and it works. We've become obsessed with this whole idea of moisture barriers. And like water does cause problems in buildings. So we went down the road of the thinking basically is if we use a moisture barrier and we keep the water out, then we'll solve the problem. But a barrier works both ways. So if we're keeping moisture out, then we're also keeping it in. And we generate a lot of moisture on the inside of buildings. So you know, baths, showers, kettles boiling, cooking, people, they all generate moisture. And that moisture gradually tries to move through the building. Like you only have to think of, you know, boiling potatoes or rice on a very cold, wet day, and the surfaces in your building are what that moisture meets. And if they're cold, non-absorbent surfaces, you're going to get condensation on the windows, even on the walls, and it begins to run. We begin to see this streaming, running moisture. And then that eventually develops into a mould problem. So if you've got a mould problem, it's got something to do with the fact that the building materials can't cope. So we need breathable building materials and we need to get rid of moisture barriers completely. And this is why we've developed like a monolithic building material. So the hemp limecrete and the plasters all absorb moisture and contain moisture within themselves. They're hygroscopic materials. So they can take a little bit of moisture and then they keep averaging it out in the entire mass. And it's such a large dry mass that it can never get high enough to create any kind of problem. And it can move out to the far side, so the wind comes and it takes the moisture away and the wall becomes like a dry desert where moisture can never build up. And in fact, this is actually part of the comfort of the building, is the fact that the inside of the wall wants to take in moisture and move it on through. So we never get any kind of mould or condensation problems, and we have a beautiful, dry, comfortable climate. There is another whole problem with how our heating systems work, because if we come into a room and there's condensation or there's a sense of dampness, we're going to want to turn on the heating system. So we turn on the heating system and then it begins to evaporate the water on the surfaces, and then it creates a stuffy atmosphere. So then we get more condensation on the windows. So what do people do? They open the windows. So we're heating the house and opening the windows. So the heat, the very expensive heat, is just drifting out the door. Not a very, very good idea. So there's this. So we're using huge amounts of energy just to keep our houses kind of vaguely comfortable because we're using the wrong building materials. So we need to go back and look at the building materials that we're using, and like our clothes. You know, like nylon shirts had kind of a brief period in the 60s and the 70s, and people very quickly discovered you want to be using nice natural building materials. You want your cottons, you want your linens. You don't want you know, synthetic fabrics. Your skin needs to be able to breathe. Exactly the same thing with a building. The envelope, the skin of the building needs to be able to allow moisture to move. So these materials are like a halfway between an insulator, which is usually a light fluffy material like fiberglass or sheep's wool, and a thermal mass material or structural material, let's say a concrete block or a cob or even steel or something like that, materials which can hold heat and energy, but they're also not very good at, they can embody it, but it passes through. So these materials are exactly in the halfway house. They're both insulating and they have thermal mass. So we go for a slightly wider wall. We don't go for a 6-inch or 150mm wall. We're going more like a 12-inch or a 300mm wall. And this just seems to be the perfect balance to give us a monolithic wall which insulates but also has thermal mass. Because what happens during the cycle is that heat energy builds up in the inside of the building, and if the heating system goes off at night, that heat actually leaks back into the building. Another interesting thing is what happens to moisture, because when the moisture, let's say you know, vapor and steam from kettles and so on, goes into the wall and is absorbed by the wall, it releases its specific heat to the mass of the wall and then radiates it back in again. So there is a lovely balance between thermal mass and what we call thermal inertia. These materials have a thermal inertia. So even if somebody opens the door and all of the heat goes straight out of the building, the warm air is gone and the door is closed again, let's say on a cold windy day, then very, very quickly we can feel the infrared radiant heat coming back off the wall again. The wall doesn't lose its heat. The heat is actually stored like a battery within the fabric of the building. And so these are the ideal materials, if you like, that combine structure, insulation, thermal mass, thermal inertia. These hygroscopic or hygrothermal materials are the ideal materials for building buildings with. And actually, if we're using anything else, we're making a mistake. Hemp is the most ancient crop on the planet. It's been grown for thousands of years. You know, somebody wanted to make a bow and arrow, they're going to use hemp because it's the strongest natural fibre. The fibre, these are the fibres you can see, these are long fibres which grow right from the base of the plant right up to 4 or 5 metres high, and the fibres are one continuous strand of fibre all the way. So we've got these fantastically strong fibres. Hemp fibre is actually stronger than steel, you know, square millimetre for square millimetre, so it's an incredibly tough material. And I can try and break this here now, and you know, I just can't do it. I can't do it because it's just too strong. A limestone, as I explained, around the ancient campfires, they noticed the limestone broke down, and what was happening was that the fire was driving off the carbonate or the CO2 from the limestone, turning it into calcium oxide. Calcium oxide is a highly reactive material with water, and it literally disintegrates very, very quickly into a paste, into a sticky paste, and that's hydrated lime, or calcium hydroxide. And this lime putty is what we combine with our hemp. But calcium hydroxide is also unstable in the presence of CO2. CO2, like in a fizzy drink, or we also have it in the air, is the fizz in the air. And that gradually fizzes into the wall and recombines with the calcium hydroxide to turn back into calcium carbonate, closing the lime cycle to give us limestone. So this is what I talk about, the slow chemistry, where the carbonation of the lime is relocking the CO2 that was released during the manufacturing process. And this is really the only lime-based. Portland cement reacts chemically. It doesn't combine the CO2. Lime does. So the carbon footprint of these materials is, not only is it neutral, it's actually better than neutral. It's negative. We're carbon locking, carbon negative. We're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Limecrete is basically hemp. We're using hemp as the aggregate, and we're binding with lime. And we use a process which reacts the two materials together to give it's a kind of like a slow chemistry which happens where the lime physically reacts and penetrates the hemp. The hemp is an absorbent material, so when we mix it with the lime slurry, the hemp pulls it into itself, into some of the voids. And then as that material dries slowly and hardens slowly, we get a very flexible organic masonry-like material, which is locking, the carbon is being locked both within the hemp plant, but also the CO2, which is driven off during the manufacture of the lime, is also reabsorbed. Unlike some other materials, lime has the ability to reabsorb the CO2 in the atmosphere, and this has something to do with the slow chemistry, and that allows the whole thing to gradually harden and mature over a period of approximately 6 months to 1 year, to give you this really flexible, elastomeric type material. There is also something about the quality of the, it's like creature comfort. I mean, we're all creatures. And you just have to see the way animals will immediately go and lie on hemp. They like it, it feels nice. I mean, the cat is in it. She's in her beautiful domain when she's lying on hemp. And in the buildings, there is a certain, it's hard to, you can only call it creature comfort. The buildings feel warm, they feel dry, but there's another quality, which is hard to define really. We've had people come into our own home and they just they can't describe what it is, but they're picking up something which is really important to them. That's about feeling good. And I mean, we've even had people actually come in and just burst into tears, and it's like slightly embarrassing, but it's like they just say, "Oh, it's just so nice here." So we've got something right. There's something that's important here, because it's important that we feel good.